Let's get on to some business news, because it seems like the business community, certainly lobby groups at least, they've been cosying up to Labor on all manner of social causes for years. Well, it hasn't worked. They're all going backwards. They're not getting favours from Labor that they thought they might. So now they've woken up. They started to actually talk about their economic book. And today they criticised the Albanese government for its economic reform inertia. The Business Council of Australia challenging the Treasurer to cut red tape, restore the coalition-era tax-to-GDP cap and implement a single payroll system in Australia to lift our stagnant productivity. Well, here, I'm joined now by business commentator at the Herald Sun, Terry McCrann. Well, hallelujah, finally they're waking up that they've actually got to get out there and argue for what's best in their company and shareholder interests and not all these woke causes, Terry.
Well, it's very hard for me to respond in one sense, Peter, because anything that the business community tries to do to get more rational policy out of Canberra is to be welcomed. But where was the business community all the way through 2023 and all the way through 2022, when the Labor Party was embarked on all its frolics, was focused on all sorts of things that had nothing to do with making for a more productive Australia? And the business community, far from actually saying, hang on guys, we've got to actually produce the goods before we start handing out the largesse. Where was the business community then? And when I say the business community, I'm talking about big business, from the Business Council down. No, the business community, big business, was all on the woke agenda, social issues gravy train that the government was running and putting in money to that process. So it's a bit late, and they've allowed the Albanese government to impose all these anti-business, anti-Australian policies across the board, most particularly in the industrial relations area, most particularly in the energy space, sending up the costs of business, making it very hard for businesses to operate profitably, being fundamentally anti-productivity. Now, the idea that this is all going to be turned around by trying to do something between now and the budget in May is, at the very best, a very hopeful fantasy.
Hopefully, though, Terry, hopefully we're now getting a business community that's putting some tension back into the relationship between business and the unions. So I'll use the example of government. You get a really good government when you've got a strong opposition. You have a weak opposition, you have a government that can do whatever it likes, and it usually takes the needle too far one way. So the tension between, and it didn't have the serial system in the parliament, as you know, the tension between government and opposition, if they're both at their best, is a better outcome for Australia. I think that's the same with the business community. You know, when the unions run roughshod and they get whatever they want out of Labor in Canberra, we end up worse off. When the business community kowtow and they have all their rainbow days and their Indigenous boycotts of Australia Day, we get a worser outcome. But when they stand up to the unions and the unions push back, about where you land in the middle is the national interest. And I think that's what's been missing.
Absolutely, Peter. And I mean, it's a process which requires taking a tough line, but also being prepared to compromise, knowing exactly what's going to work in the interest not only of the business, but actually the workforce as well. So you have an arm wrestle with the union, you have an arm wrestle with government, and the object is to actually end up with something that works for both of you productively going forward. But when I look out there across the business landscape, I don't see the sort of business leaders we had in the 1980s and 1990s that were so important in this process. People like Hugh Morgan, people like R.V. Parbo, people that were actually able to do these sorts of balancing acts, but coming from a strong pro-business, pro-outcomes, pro-productivity, and that's ultimately a pro-worker, pro-individual Australian perspective.
What about this push from a lot of the big industry super funds, Cbus Super, Care Super, Host Plus? All of them are out there saying they're going to put millions and millions into affordable housing. We know, of course, I think it was Cbus that put $500 million recently into so-called affordable housing. But these are the same funds and the unions and, of course, Labor, their masters. They all oppose ordinary Australians getting hold of their super for their own home. I mean, this is pretty hypocritical.
Well, and we know the reason for that, Peter, don't we? Because if individual Australians tap their super to fund the purchase or the building of a home, that super is then not in the that money is not in the control of the union super funds, generating income for the industry super funds and other super funds, obviously, as well. So the super funds don't want to see individual Australians making decisions about their own money. They want to leave that in the hands of themselves to generate profits and to generate income for the super fund. We're all in favour of more investment in affordable housing, but it's got to be done in a way that's actually going to work and be done efficiently. I mean, the problem in this space, as we know, Peter, is there's this huge immigration inflow, which has created this extraordinary demand for housing, and secondly, all the issues which make it very hard to build houses, from land zoning issues at the state and council level to the cost of building and the cost of building supplies. So that's where we need the solutions, not by playing games with the funds that are sitting in super funds.
Just before we go quickly, Terry, on this point about affordable housing, I mean, is this housing that people will actually themselves own, like if I bought my own home with my own super money, or is this like in the Victorian government housing scheme, housing that the government owns a stake in, that eventually if I sell it, I've got to pay it back to the government? Or is it like the old housing commission model? How does it work?
Well, I can't give you the answer to that, Peter. I don't know. But ideally, we would want a mix of the two. Ultimately, the single best thing that worked for Australia through the 50s, 60s and in the 20th century was owning your own home. So that's the ultimate objective across the spectrum, not just high-income earners, not just middle-income earners. Everybody should really have a stake in owning their own home.